Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee, shot in the face as he stood alone on the balcony of his hotel room. He died in a hospital an hour later. Last night, he said this.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop.
On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed between France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, Italy, Portugal, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. The pact was designed to keep within the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. The treaty members realized that real peace is more than an absence of war, and they seek to promote political and economic stability in the North Atlantic area. To ensure this, they are sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all.
Wow, there are two significant moments on this day in history that have connections to today's major events in Ukraine and on Capitol Hill. 73 years before the war in Ukraine, world leaders gathered in Washington to form the NATO alliance. And 54 years ago today, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. Today, Dr. King's vision takes another big step with a partial Senate vote on the Supreme Court nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson. Joining us now, historian and Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, Jon Meacham. He discusses the formation of NATO in the debut episode of his new podcast, Reflections of History, out today. Also with us, the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton. This week, National Action Network brings together civil rights leaders from across the country for their Convention 2022.
Wildy, why don't we go to Reverend Al first before we go to Meacham? Yeah, and he ruins the whole conversation.
Well, what?
Like we're talking about
he just says
Shays
sometimes.
Rebellion and
he goes
the
deep.
Peruvian Land Act of 1840.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, that is a good one, though. And
I like it. It's soothing.
He can tell us how that actually is what led to the
kind
Civil
of
War.
calms me.
It does. Put you to sleep. I play this podcast. You said, "Can you put on Meacham, honey?"
Well, that's
I want to go to sleep.
You want to hear something funny?
What's that?
When I was training for the marathon right before the race, I was interviewed and somebody said, "What do you listen to when you run? AC/DC,
Yeah,
Jay-Z, what is it?"
Yeah.
And I said, "I listen to Jon Meacham podcasts."
What?
And they were absolutely stunned because they figured that would cut or add about an hour to my time.
Well, of course, but it didn't.
But somehow I crossed the finish line.
Very soothing. A very mindful run. A very mindful run.
This is just
so,
mean.
so, Rev, let's talk about a third historic thing that's going to happen today that's connected, actually, to the anniversary of the passing of Martin Luther King. And that, of course, is a vote on Capitol Hill.
No, what we see today, and you and I as old Baptists would say is providential, that on the 54th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, the Senate Judiciary Committee will be voting on a black woman, which would have been unthinkable at the time of King's assassination, being nominated to the Supreme Court. And I think that it shows that the dreamer may have been killed, but the dream moves even more and more toward realization, because here's a young woman that went to public schools in Miami, Florida, and went all the way to Harvard, and now is on the precipice of going to the Supreme Court. And what a lot of people, other than probably Jon Meacham and those of us that grew up in the movement, don't realize is when Dr. King went to Memphis that day, he went because he had gone a few days before to lead a march for the striking garbage workers. And there were those that felt King was too moderate that disrupted the march. There was a riot and someone was killed. He came back to prove that he could do nonviolent marches and have peace, sort of like the friction you hear today of those that are far left and those that say that others are too moderate. Right. He came back in because of the militants that disrupted, and that's when he was killed. killed. And people forget that this infighting has always happened. And that's one of the reasons why we always have our convention of National Action Network the week of Dr. King's assassination to remind us the goals are there. And I thought about this morning what Dr. King would be thinking about what's going on in Ukraine, because he also died fighting the war in Vietnam. He refused to be limited to just domestic issues. So there's a lot of thoughts that goes through our head as we watch the judge go for a confirmation this morning, and remember the level Dr. King brought this country to.
Yeah, and John Meacham, I always thought one of your most moving podcasts was when you retold the story of that extraordinary April 3rd, 1968 speech by Dr. King. It was raining outside. Yeah. He didn't want to go. Was it Ralph Abernathy who came back to him and said, Dr. King, you have to go. The people are packed. They came out in the rain. They want to see you. But you look, the words that night actually foretold what's happening today. He like Moses, you know, I may not get there with you, but I've seen over the mountaintop. You've just got to believe this is part of what he saw.
It is part of what he saw, and I will say this daily podcast we're doing, I wanted to call it Mika's Moments because I knew she would be so excited about it.
There you go.
That didn't survive the first marketing meeting, but we're working on that.
Why not?
So there's the theme here, and the Reverend can correct me, obviously, is democracy. That's what's going on, obviously, with this remarkable human drama in Ukraine. And what's happening with the judge today and what Dr. King was talking about. On the Sunday before he was assassinated, so 4 days before, Dr. King preached at Washington National Cathedral. And he said, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That's the way God's universe is made. That's the way it is structured. He spoke of democracy as a covenant, that we have to see each other as neighbors and not as adversaries. And we should love each other. If everybody loved each other all the time, Jesus wouldn't have had to make the commandment. You know, you don't command someone to do something they're already doing. But what we're seeing is this ferocious and wonderful human spirit to be free, both at home in the United States, in this imperfect, complicated, disputatious country we keep trying to make a little more perfect, and these remarkable people in the heart of Europe who are standing up against an autocrat who's going to go down in history as a butcher. But why are they standing up? They're standing up because they want to determine their own destiny. They don't want to be the subjects of a czar.
So, Rev. Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.